Good morning and welcome to Life Expansion After 50 podcast. Today's episode is about the high impact step in the stimulus response cycle. Now, every step is important, but getting a handle on the space between stimulus and reaction can change your life. And furthermore, between reaction and response. That section can take as little as a half a second or less. And if we don't get a handle on that, we have a much harder time doing anything that happens after that. Research tells us we make about 30,000 decisions each day. Now, this number will vary depending on who you talk to, but assuming we have between 50 and 60,000 waking seconds in a day, that's about a decision every other second. If you accept that 95% of our lives are run by habit, which I do, I first heard that in 1980, and I would say it's true. Since then, I've made hundreds of nuances, but the metric still holds. If the above is true, you also have to agree that virtually all of those 30,000 or so decisions are coming out of habit. I mean, every other second, are you literally thinking about each one? Probably not. The reason I say the space between stimulus, reaction, and response is a high impact area is because the first half of the stimulus response cycle is fully in the subconscious realm. Since the subconscious is predisposed to look for threats, we see threats where there are none. We also magnify the threats that are actually there. Now, how many Serengeti tiger level threats can we actually have in a lifetime? For most of us, maybe 2 or 3. Yet, the subconscious can treat every threat at that level, causing a release of a corresponding amount of cortisol and then adrenaline if we don't get it handled. In other words, for minor threats, we could still be getting the amount of cortisol necessary for the level of a tiger coming at us. That's not healthy. By simply training the subconscious to see 50% fewer threats, and I believe you can reduce it by even more than that, what can that do to our decisions? What can it do for our state of mind, our stress levels? Most importantly, the decisions that follow those decisions. For most people, when they're attempting to change a habit, they start inside the stimulus response cycle and they focus on the response. However, that's too late. The horse has left the barn. We know that the subconscious has a reaction time of as little as 150 milliseconds. That's just over a tenth of a second. The conscious mind has a reaction time of about a half second. So in that space right there, that's when the horse has left the barn. There's a reaction step before the response step. Now, we call it a stimulus response cycle, but when you deconstruct it, there's a step in between there. And here's how I distinguish between the two. Reaction. It's an instinctive emotional response that's often impulsive and fast. Reactions are influenced by past experiences or fears. And I know I have the word response in the definition of reaction. Now here's response. A thoughtful, deliberate action that involves considering the situation, weighing options, and making a conscious decision. Responses take more time to develop and deliver than reactions. Now, if you're making a decision every other second, how much time do you really think you're putting into weighing options? As a result, you can see that it's easy for our response to equal our reaction, and that's a problem. Continuing that line of thinking, the next step is action. We can act on our responses or not. Here's how I would distinguish acting. Action. An action is an act of the will or the completion of a task, step, or intention. For example, speaking, crying, eating, jumping, kicking, running, smiling, and on and on. Even thinking can be thought of as an action. So you can see that between reaction, there should be a choice of how we respond. If the reaction is a Serengeti tiger, and we let our response equal our reaction, that you can see how you can become triggered. But if you can make a choice between reaction and response, you now have the opportunity to move that entire stimulus response cycle towards your life, serving your life design. This is in the series of the unseen power of words, and that's because words come into play at each step in my expanded stimulus response cycle, which includes the pre-stimulus phase. Now, while it can be nuanced and the distinctions may not be perfect, I maintain we need to deconstruct what is happening because it happens in less than half of a second. Once deconstructed, we can create habits within the stimulus response cycle through synaptogenesis. That's the process that's underway in neuroplasticity. We want to have that process aligned with our life design. In a prior episode, I used the example, real time, with the audience, demonstration exercise of getting rid of ums and speaking idiosyncrasies. So check out, I think it's episode 67 where I covered that. Before jumping in, I want to do a quick review. When we arrive at those 30,000 decisions each day, we do so in a state of being. That state of being is also habitual. And it's either biased towards serving our life vision or serving the way it's always been. I would say by default, since 95% of everything we do is done by habit, the unconscious life vision is therefore the way it's always been, and that becomes the default life vision. That's why New Year's resolutions last less than a few weeks, if that. And anyone who goes to the gym regularly sees it in action every January, and it's like clockwork. This is what I call the pre-stimulus phase of the expanded stimulus response cycle. How we arrive at that stimulus, that state of being. Now, habit change starts here. We need both, and both the pre-stimulus phase and the stimulus response phase are interdependent, and each can influence the other. It's like the chicken or the egg, which comes first, and they both can have an impact on the other. In the prior 5 episodes, I broke down each step, as I said, and gave an example of what we can do to shift the automaticity of habit towards serving our life design. In the pre-stimulus phase, there are 4 cognitive factors that I consider, plus our physiology. Now, physiology is often overlooked because people think of the subconscious as a mind. That's what it's been called for hundreds of years. However, we know it's the firing and wiring of 100 billion neurons, each interacting with thousands of other neurons. These neural pathways are why we get the 11 million bits per second processing speed of the subconscious. Think energy flowing through the neural pathways. Energy moves fast. Of these 100 billion neurons, about 86 billion are in the brain, with 20 billion being in the prefrontal cortex. And I bring that up because the prefrontal cortex largely was formed between age 19 and 27. And those executive functions, self-control, planning, organizing, directing, controlling, those functions are new. Many of them are new with the prefrontal cortex, which is why we may have had more willpower in our teens. We may have had less risk aversion in our teens because we didn't have the self-control mechanisms that sometimes will slow us down in the case of willpower. It's actually called I don't want power. In other words, when the willpower and the I don't want power get into conflict, we can feel like we're fighting against ourselves. Now, all this processing requires energy. In a resting state, we're using about 80% of our metabolism just to exist. About 25% of that 80%, that's just for the brain. In a resting state, it's monitoring our functions and running those 95% habitual thought patterns. The 4 factors in the pre-stimulus phase, beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, and mindset, are covered, each in its own prior episode. The 5th factor I haven't covered is physiology, which, as I said, plays an important role in determining our state of being as we encounter life stimuli. High performance isn't just about mental readiness. It's deeply intertwined with physical preparedness. Our body's condition, hydration, nutrition, sleep, and movement directly impact brain functions. Emotional resilience and decision-making ability are an outgrowth of that. When we're dehydrated or nutrient deprived, blood flow to the brain is compromised, reducing oxygen delivery and cognitive clarity. Sleep deprivation similarly hinders the brain's ability to regulate emotions and make sound decisions. Even posture matters. Standing tall and breathing deeply can significantly increase confidence just by signaling and reducing stress hormones. This benefits both the internal game and the external game. High performance physiology means aligning our body's needs with our goals. Hydration, movement, balanced nutrition, and restorative sleep aren't optional, they're foundational. When we prioritize these areas, we show up with greater energy, focus, and resilience, making it easier to pause, reflect, and respond thoughtfully in the space between stimulus and reaction. It doesn't end there. We still have to condition that reaction. Let me illustrate where we are in unfolding the expanded stimulus response cycle. What we've talked about up until now, we have our 4 factors in the pre-stimulus phase. We have beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, and mindset. And then in the stimulus response phase, we have the stimulus, we have the reaction, we have the response, and we have the reaction. So today I'm going to talk about the space between stimulus and response and reaction and response. And we want those arrows to be working towards our life design. This is what I mean when I talk about putting the automaticity to work for us. If these arrows are not working towards us, you can imagine them being, let's say, red. Now, I want to talk about this stimulus box for a moment. This is so interconnected. Why? I'll tell you from a layperson's perspective on this. I'm not a neuroscientist. I would say that with 100 billion neurons, 100 billion of anything is, think about it. If you moved 1,000 neurons every day, it would take you 273,000 years to move 100 billion neurons. I just say that to illustrate how many 100 billion actually is. And so if there's 100 billion of anything, anywhere, it's a dominating force, right? Think about it. So this is why it goes both ways. And then those 100 billion neurons interact with each of them with thousands of other neurons. So we have all of this interacting going on. It's no wonder life can seem so difficult, because the cause is the effect and the effect is the cause, right? What I said last 5 episodes is around this stimulus response, or leading to it, we have our beliefs, we have neuroplasticity, we have priming, and we have mindset. So if I talk about them each individually, the beliefs, we have both the core beliefs, the ones that we actually thought about and created on purpose, and then we have the dispositional beliefs. They were the ones that were given to us. Those are the beliefs that we're not even aware that we have them. They're just there. And they show up when we least expect it. These are the limiting beliefs sometimes, because it was put in our head, money's bad, or you'll never amount to anything, or whatever limiting beliefs there are. And there's so many of them. And what I did in the beliefs episode is I did an exercise that you can actually uncover the origin of the limiting belief. And once you uncover the origin, you can look at the references. And sometimes just by seeing the references and becoming aware that those references are not or are no longer valid, that's enough to collapse the belief. But it's bigger than that, because we have things stacked on top of the belief. So there's resistance to changing a belief. Then we have the neuroplasticity, and that process of neuroplasticity is actually synaptogenesis. It's difficult to change a habit because the deep-seated habits are the neural pathways, the neurons are wrapped with myelin, and that speeds up, it increases the accuracy, increases the strength of the impulse. However, the synapse between the neurons, that's dynamic. And synaptogenesis is the process of the synapses moving from one neural pathway to another based on where it's needed. Think of dopamine and serotonin, these are neurotransmitters. So these are the sort of the vehicle of the neural pathways from one neuron to the other. And by moving it away from one pathway to another, that's why layering on a new habit is much more effective than removing a habit or trying to stop a habit. Then we have priming, and priming is all around us. I talk about it being internal and external. So we have our words, We have the words of other people. We have our environment. Sometimes you can walk into a place and remember things. You can maybe smell something and remember things. It comes in through our senses, but it's very, very pervasive. And because marketers use it, it's all around us. It's all through social media. It's embedded in the design of many of the social media apps because they want to keep you on the application. And so priming is used there. Priming is used in ad copy because it's positioning us. It's used in sales presentations because it's preconditioning the mind to receive the next bit of information in a certain way. So we have to be vigilant about priming ourselves. We literally can set the habit to reduce the weight of external stimuli compared to internal stimuli. I want my external stimuli to be like 20%. I want my internal stimuli to be 80%. Think about it. A lot of people may be walking around with the opposite. The external is all about what's happening out there. But it's not what happens. It's our attitude about what happens. It's how we react to what happens. So we already know this. What I'm talking about is making it habitual. So we have to create habits here. We even have to create the habit of neuroplasticity because we use neuroplasticity after the stimulus, but we have to use neuroplasticity here for the pre-stimulus. And then we have priming. That's what I was just talking about, and then mindset. I think mindset is, while I want to say it's overused, I think it's also misused. Mindset is extremely important. Having a growth mindset, and I talk about just adding the word yet behind a statement that says, I don't know how to do it yet. It helps trigger think about those 100 billion neurons. Adding the word yet, the neurons engage and, we're still working on this, versus saying, I don't know how to do it. The neurons that engage are the ones that are more aligned with, it's done deal, it's closed book. But what I like to say about mindset is that people think that they have a growth mindset because they read some books or maybe they set goals and work towards those goals, or maybe because of what they've achieved. But I'll tell you, you can have a growth mindset, and I'm going to use the metaphor of a book. You can have a growth mindset about the book. You can even have a growth mindset about most of the chapters. But all you need is a fixed mindset on one chapter of this book. I'm using it as a metaphor for our life, our task, our project. If you have a fixed mindset about one aspect of that project, it could stop you in your tracks. It's even worse than that. You can have a growth mindset about the book. You can have a growth mindset about every chapter in the book, but you have a fixed mindset about one paragraph in one of the chapters. That stops you from getting through the tasks necessary to reach your life design. So when we're thinking about a life design, we have to be, again, vigilant about identifying where we have a fixed mindset. And as you unpeel the onion, new fixed mindsets show up, right? You've seen this. You've seen it with yourself. You've seen it with other people. Every time you take another step, another fixed mindset shows up. I think that's at play with the Peter Principle. I talk about that in the Dynamic Leadership series, where Peter Principle is pretty well accepted that it occurs, and that is where a person is promoted to one level beyond their effectiveness or ability to be effective. And as you unpeel the onion, or as you take that next step, as you get into unfamiliar, by the way, the subconscious perceives the unfamiliar as a threat. So as we do that, again, we can get triggered into a fixed mindset in an area that we didn't even know existed. Next thing you know, you have a fixed mindset. Yet, you're the same person who believes you have a growth mindset. So I want to make this a much more dynamic conversation, this mindset. And then what I want to talk about today is the physiology. Physiology is, like I said, often overlooked because people think of this as mental cognitive processing. I would say the majority of cognitive processing is physiological. It's just a math. It's simple math. You got 100 billion neurons. Each interacts with thousands of other neurons. We make about 30,000 decisions in a day. That aligns with 95% of our lives being run by habit. That habit lies in neural pathways. The neural pathways are physiological. See, when a person dies, their mind, their spirit, their soul, it's gone. But what's on earth is their brain and their nervous system. And those are the neural pathways. Now, what may be gone is the energy that's running through them, But it's the neural pathways and the neurotransmitter that's enabling the energy to run through it. It's like having electricity running through wires, but if you remove the wires, that energy is no longer being controlled or directed. So physiology is very, very important. It's why it's the second area, my 7 fitness areas roadmap, which, by the way, the 7 fitness areas roadmap is how this plays out. I don't work on it like this. We work on it from the 7 fitness areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. Get a handle on that. And then you can work on the relationship, professional, and financial. And this makes the shift from have, do, be to be, do, have. Because what we want to do is arrive at the stimulus. We want to arrive at the stimulus in a state of being that's optimal. We've got the beliefs, neuroplasticity, physiology, priming, mindset. And then those all go into our state of being. And then we want to have that state of being appropriate for our stimulus response. Now, if we're making 30,000 decisions in a day and there's 50 to 60,000 waking seconds in a day, it stands to reason that all that's habitual and it's being driven by this state of being. And this is where we have to do some work if we're going to fix this over here. You can work on fixing this over here, but I think the deck is stacked against you, because those 100 billion neurons, they start firing and wiring. That thing gets kicked off in 100 or 200 milliseconds, and the conscious mind is not even aware of it. How can you fix something you're not even aware of? And then once the conscious mind is aware, you potentially have processed 3, 4 million, 5 million bits of information. It's already off and running. When you see somebody getting triggered, you actually see this in action. Now, before we get into the stimulus response, and I talk about this a lot in my Above the Line series, we're going through life, right? And then we're trying to break through. But what happens is, as we start working on the pre-stimulus phase, we might not see, this is, by the way, this is the upper limit, this is the lower limit, and this is the breakthrough. So there is a barrier between our upper limit and breaking through. This is why it can seem so hard. And in this space, we have a lot of cognitive dissonance, because as we're trying to break through, we're literally going against beliefs, we're going against habits, and that cognitive dissonance comes in because we're not supposed to be there. It's not available to us in our belief system, yet we're going after it. And you're literally, that cognitive dissonance, the way I describe it, is you're literally experiencing the neuroplasticity in action. A lot of times, if you're breaking through, I can't say this is true for everything, but if you're in the midst of breaking through something and you're in that area, you're going to have this brain fog. And as you get that brain fog, if you can recognize it as the cognitive dissonance that has to come. In other words, to have a breakthrough, you first have to go through a stage of confusion, because a breakthrough is by definition a break with the past. If you're breaking with the past, there has to be some kind of confusion or some kind of a rearrangement of ideas for you to have that breakthrough. That process is the neuroplasticity in action that's being forced on yourself. Fortunately, we can also do this intentionally. It's a lot easier once you get up here in the possibility realm, but you can also do it down here. But this barrier is what I say takes 3 to 6 months to get through. If you want to do the inner work faster, harder, with more energy, that's why I like to work with people. I prefer to work with people who have a purpose or self-actualization or some major life vision. If you don't have that, I'd rather see that happen first, because you're going to need that kind of strength to get through the fears that will continue to pop up, the fixed mindsets that will continue to pop up, the cognitive dissonance that can set you back. See, the excitement and cognitive dissonance of crossing this barrier has the same signature as anxiety. And without understanding that, it's very easy to get in there, feel the anxiety, and do a 180. And now you're going back the other way. So as I was saying here, when we start working on this, let's say you start meditating. And then, you start drinking more water, keeping yourself hydrated so your brain is not depleted. You start doing some physical exercise, you start working on your nutrition, you start working on your transformation of vocabulary, you're intentionally doing some priming. The point I'm making is, while you're making progress, while your lows are getting higher, you may not see any action here. People who've made major strides in dieting have experienced this. They may go a long period of time and it seems like nothing's happening, and then all of a sudden they break through. That's because 95% of our life is by habit. And we keep falling back, and then the habit influences the pre-stimulus area, and then the pre-stimulus area predisposes us as we get into the stimulus response. So once this breaks through, I wish I could tell you easy sailing through there, but then it happens again. It happens again where you go through this process up and down, and unfortunately, sometimes this gets to be so stressful, people can just give up, give in, and then again, it's reinforced that, oh, I guess it's not available to me. What we want to do is break through, and when you break through, of course, you have a new problem up there, but it's a good problem to have, and that's a nice step into our positivity discussion. So this here, talking about how we arrive at our stimulus response. So even if you do all the work in the pre-stimulus phase, understand it may not happen overnight. This is why you can read a book and it says do this and do this and do this, and you do those things and you don't see any progress. If you start measuring, for example, how many times were you anxious in a week, and then how much anxiety did you have in those times that you were anxious, and then how long was the duration of the anxiety, you'll start to see improvements here, even though you haven't seen the breakthrough yet. So we've got the stimulus, reaction, response. And again, our target is to have green arrows, so it's the automaticity of serving us. Now, the stimulus can be all sorts of things. It comes from internal, external. It could be ideas. It could be smells. It could be what somebody said. It could be a thought. It could be a letter. You see a return address on an envelope. You see somebody sends you an email. All of these things can be a stimulus. And then that leads to a reaction. So in this stimulus, I say we have there's two areas that we want to focus on. And I talked about the positivity in last week's episode. So we have positivity. That's a training mechanism that we're doing because this step happens so fast from stimulus to reaction, like 150 milliseconds to maybe 250, 300 milliseconds, so less than a half a second. And if you don't condition it in, then it's going to be what it's always been. We have to condition in the one that we want. We also have mental contrasting, I would say here. Mental contrasting can apply across all the steps. The short version is that you're not going to really condition mental contrasting in, but by putting mental contrasting as a step in your goal setting and in your planning, by thinking about mental contrasting, what we're doing is actually priming ourselves better for the positivity. So let's talk about these two. Positivity is a way of thinking. So if you take stimulus, reaction, and you take that the subconscious is predisposed to look for threats, what we're going to do there with the positivity exercise is literally retrain the subconscious to where it does not see everything as a threat. This is why I say you can get it reduced. I think you can get it down to where less than 10% of the stimuli that come in would be seen as a threat. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to like put you in harm's way or maybe have you not respecting the danger of, say, a rattlesnake. But it's not treating the fact that there's a rattlesnake and it's 30 feet away. You're not going to have a Serengeti tiger level response on that. So let me talk about it in the context of setting a goal, achieving your vision, whatever that might be. The positivity exercise, and it takes about 6 weeks to get it to set in. You'll see improvements in a week or two, and that's back to that line where the lows get higher, right? But it takes about 6 weeks to make it a real habit. And what we're doing is using deep practice. And we're going to do this exercise 3 times a day. I recommend doing it with meals. It takes a minute and a half, if that. In the beginning, it might take a little bit longer, but that's going to become a habit too. And somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd week, you want to start using it in real time through the day, actually working the habit. So we're going from awareness to actually doing it and making it a habitual exercise and then to using it in the real world. So you think 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. But overall, it's a 6 week process. What you're going to do is teach the subconscious to assess if something that's coming in is a threat or is it simply part of the context for our goal. So, for example, let's say that you have a goal, you set a goal to have a business, and now you have this business, and there's going to be things that come in that you didn't anticipate. That just happens, right? Stuff happens. And one of those things happened. You lose a client, for example. On its own, losing an important client could send you into a spiral, right? It could send you into a, oh no, the house is on fire. But what we're doing is training the subconscious to assess, is this part of the bigger positive context, which is having the business? If it's part of the bigger positive context, then we've chosen to do it. It's part of the business. It just goes with the territory. We have to learn it. It's no big deal. The subconscious moves on to look for other threats. But because you've trained it this way, it's going to always look at it, is it part of the bigger context? The easy example I use is if you get a flat tire in your car, it's easy to say, oh, my day is ruined. It's downhill from here, whatever. Now you're going to be late for something. Maybe you don't know how to change a tire. All of this stuff comes in. What we're doing is training the subconscious to see that having a flat tire is part of the bigger context, the bigger positive context of having a car. So this is not just gratitude. It's not positive mental attitude. It's not reframing. It's a very deliberate process because you're training the subconscious, something that happens in 150 milliseconds in some cases. You're retraining it to not look for threats because you're not a hunter-gatherer. You're not out there hunting around lions and tigers and bears. You are going through a fairly predictable life, comparatively speaking, a very predictable life. So we don't have to have this same kind of alert for threats. And not only that, because of the way technology is continuing to expand, and you think about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, you see how we're on that steep part of the curve. It's very easy to have these triggering events throughout the entire day. So by training the subconscious to do that, and the way you're going to train it is every day with meals, you imagine something that you've had a negative experience with in the past. In the beginning, we don't want to start with anything current. Just come up with some things in the past. And we all have them. You're going through the day and you see something and it reminds you of, oh, this negative thing happened to me. Oh, I did that. I stubbed my toe. I had an accident. I dropped this. I broke that. I lost my job. I did, whatever it is. Think of it, and then real time, as soon as you think of it, look for the greater positive context. So if you lost your job, the greater positive context is you're moving, you have a career, you're working on your career. You had the income, you've gained the experience. This is a step in the process of building your career. I'm going to speak in public and I dropped something on my clothing and now I've got this stain. Could be seen as the end of the world, but when you look at it this way, the larger positive context is speaking as a goal of mine. This is just part of that. It moves it from being a threat to just an annoyance. It's like transformational vocabulary, but it's happening real time without your intervention because you're training it in. You're literally training that step to happen without your involvement. The same way that we train athletes, so that athletes train to have automatic responses. This is what I mean. Again, automaticity is working for us. And so you want to do that, come up with 3 of those every day with every meal. So each meal you do 3 times, come up with some negative thing, and immediately look for the larger positive context and spend a few seconds, mindfulness, leaning into that positive context, being grateful for the positive context, and then repeat it. This, like I said, you can do this in 90 seconds, all 3 of them. Do it 3 times a day. Do that for 6 weeks, and you'll find that you are triggered less, you have less anxiety, and you are more resourceful because you're not going down these paths. The reason I put mental contrasting here is because mental contrasting, the short version, is recognizing that we're doing something difficult. Good to Great by Jim Collins, he talks about it as the Stockdale paradox. We know that what we have to do is very difficult, but we also believe that we'll prevail. when you're going above the line, when you're going into the possibilities, when we're going against the grain, we have to recognize that it's hard. Too many people step into this above the line work, not acknowledging that it's hard and difficult. And then when they have setbacks, it's like, can't do it. Imagine putting the training wheels back on a kid's bicycle because the first time out they fell. No, we know it's going to be a process. We know it's going to take some time. Well, let's say that, a kid is starting in first grade and the first time they get a bad grade, we say, oh, they're not going to do it. Let's take them out of school and put them to work. No, you know that it's a process. It's a step-by-step process. It's going to be difficult, but we will prevail. There will be setbacks, but we will prevail. And that's the mental contrasting, is you want to step into this with an understanding that there's going to be obstacles, and then you could create solutions for those obstacles. Many people pushed back against that because they don't want to think about the obstacles. It's different in an operational environment. In an operational environment, you don't have to focus on the obstacles because it's habitual. You just want to keep moving forward and it works itself out. Your amplitude of the cycle is a lot less because the operational environment has infrastructure around it that keeps things at the mean. When we're above the line, we're all over the place. Now, there'll be a reversion to the mean, but it may take some time. And I would say that the distinction in an operational environment, yeah, it's okay to positive mental attitude. Let's go. Let's don't think about the obstacles. Just do it. But when you're going above the line, you want to engage in the mental contrasting step. That's going to help you with the reaction, the stimulus to reaction. And then in the response, what we're going to do is implementation intentions. Now, the implementation intentions, because this is coming after the half-second mark, 500 milliseconds, is coming after the half-second mark. This side over here is conscious thinking. But keep in mind, you could have layers and layers and layers and layers of these stimulus response cycles going on, right? This is, basically when a person is triggered, they're getting many of these happening and they're just layering on and more neurons are firing with more neurons and on, right? If you see somebody, if you've experienced spiraling, you can see why this is at play. So while this side of this is conscious, it could be part of a bigger cycle that's underway, and there could be some subconscious work, but that's beyond the scope of this. And so then this side is subconscious. So since this side is conscious, we can actually do something about it with implementation intentions. Implementation intentions in a simple form are if then. When this happens, I'm going to do this. If that happens, I'm going to do this. This is not a plan B. This is more about in the moment stuff. If I have to speak before an audience and I find out some bad news, because how many of us have gone through 10 different presentations before audiences and not one of them had a hiccup? Hiccups come. And so why not have an implementation intention? If I get bad news or if I get a change, something that's unexpected, I'm going to turn away and find something to focus on as I think about it. You could say, I'm going to go to the restroom and sit in a stall and get mindful, go into a state of mindfulness and remind myself of why I'm doing this. You could make it as, I'm going to focus on the greater positive context. But what the positivity step does, it keeps you from being in fight or flight so that your implementation intention actually can take hold. Said another way, if I don't do the positivity step, I'm doing the implementation intention on a set of neurons that are firing and wiring, and they're off and running. It's like mob mentality. How do you stop a mob when 4 million neurons have already been triggered? But by having the positivity step, the subconscious put that on the side because it's already looked at the positive context, and your implementation intention could be, when bad news happens, I'm going to lean into and get mindful and focus on the greater context and step into a state of gratitude. Now, the implementation intentions can also be visualization. You can do this implementation intention, I talk about in dynamic leadership doing checkpoints, and I talk about a two-way, doing a 360, a live 360, where you ask the person, in the context of creating a high-performance environment, what are some things I as a leader can start doing? What are some things I can stop doing? What are some things I can continue doing? You don't quite say it like that, but that's what you're pulling out of the person. And you can have an implementation intention. If they come up with something bad that I'm doing, here's what I'm going to do. If they come up with nothing at all, here's what I'm going to do. You don't just walk into these unknown situations with no intention. What happens in this stage right here, from the reaction to the response is you literally can train your subconscious to leverage the speed of the reticular activating system. Now remember, the reticular activating system is what filters the 11 million bits of information that are being processed each second, and it filters it down to what's important to us. This is why goal setting, when you set a goal, you get this unexpected serendipity happening. The stuff was already there in most cases. It's just that now we're aware of it because the reticular activating system is cued to look for that. So what we're doing in this step, we're training the reticular activating system, which is, I would say, part of the subconscious for layperson's terminology, to filter through a set of responses. And what I want to see in these three, I want to see three choices. And remember, it processes 11 million bits per second. I want to be presented with three possibilities that I can do. Three possibilities. And you can get more detail on that. You can have a, ideal one, a low effort one, or whatever, right? But you want to have three choices, and then you respond out of those three choices. This whole thing is happening in less than 3/4 of a second, which is why we have to train it at the subconscious level. Once you've done that, the next step will be action. My action, just like my response doesn't have to equal my reaction, my action doesn't have to equal my response. My response could be that I'm going to do it, I'm going to delegate it, I'm going to delay it, I'm going to dump it and not care about it. That could be my response. Think about that as the what. The how I do that could be the action. There's other ways to look at it as well. It's how I speak. It could be, the response could be, I need to confront the person. But don't stop there. Go to the next step. Again, you could have implementation intentions. We've got the mental contrasting helping us. But now we're clearly in the conscious mind stage. And one of the things that you can that I would program in is the problem solving model. Einstein says that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes talking about it and 5 minutes working on it, on the solution. You could literally do a really quick, I'm talking like a 1/4 second quick problem analysis, clearly define the problem. So in other words, before you act, before you take the action of the response, before you say it, you can do a mini problem solving step, clearly identify the problem. And then the next step after that obviously would be look at possible solutions. So those possible solutions have already happened here, but now you're doing it with the conscious mind. And these are pauses, but we're talking again about pauses at the 1/4 to 1/2 second level. It's not even noticeable. It's everybody has the right to have some thinking time in the midst of a new stimulus. And you take that second and a half. And then the other thing we'll talk about next week before the action after the action, then we'll talk about the emotional modulation. Because after you do all of this, you could still face a Serengeti tiger level threat. And when you face that Serengeti tiger level threat, you want to have the right response. Again, what we're doing is we're putting the automaticity of the subconscious to work towards our life design. And we've got to take care of this stimulus response stage because it's so fast, but it's interdependent with the pre-stimulus phase, so we have to look at them together. And the thing that is going to happen here is our proactivity will go up, our choices will go up, and the quality of our choices will go up. And then we could talk about other things, KPIs and feedback mechanisms, etc., to help that along. But this, to me, is where agency resides. It starts with personal leadership. That's the pre-stimulus. Having agency is being able to access the best version of ourselves. And through that agency, then we can lead others more effectively and we can make the decisions in our lives more effectively. That's it. I'm going to leave it there now.